People usually think of Peter Parker and think of a fun, web-spinning hero, swinging through New York without much of a care, cracking wise and always friendly and kind to those he meets. But underneath this exterior, there is a lot of trauma that exists just beneath the surface. Welcome back, Nerd Squad. Today we're going to talk about some of the traumas that Spider-Man has experienced throughout the multiverse and beyond, as we count down the top 10 dark Spider-Man stories. And if you love exploring the dark corners of the multiverse, you gotta check out our top 10 dark alternates playlist. Click on over here to do it. Do it now! And be sure to stick around to the end of this list where I will have some bonus content coming your way. Then click that playlist. Do it. Or, you know, maybe open it up in a separate tab now and then you can come back to it after. Whatever you want to do. Alright, let's get counting. Number 10. JJ and Henry Abrams SpiderMan. This story is dark in many different ways. When JJ and his son Henry Abrams announced that they were writing a Spider-Man comic together, fans were intrigued to see what they'd do. JJ Abrams is known for being a controversial, albeit successful film director and writer. He's directed Mission Impossible 3 and the Star Trek film, and written Cloverfield and Star Wars films, The Force Awakens and Rise of Skywalker. It's been an interesting road for him. Alas, the comic he wrote with his son was not dark in quite the way that we maybe had hoped. The story pits a young Ben Parker, Peter's son, against the slow-to-speak but eerie Cadaverous. He faces this threat with his dad, who abandoned him when he was younger after his mother Mary Jane had died. Or at least we think she died. Oh yeah, and Peter also has a hook for a hand? I don't know. Tony Stark also appears in this dark and bizarre story as a more eccentric and older version of himself. It's a weird time. Number 9. Life Theft. This 3-part story took place in the 90s, starting in Amazing Spider-Man issue number 386. It featured a Vulture who had once again become young after draining the life force out of Spider-Man, using a device known as the Juvenator. This cures Vulture of his cancer and makes him young and strong once again. Fully rejuvenated, the Vulture sets out to take revenge on all those who wronged him, planning to kill them, leaving Peter Parker as a withered old man. Eventually, however, this resolved itself as the Juvenator's effects are only temporary. But this is also the story where Peter discovers that the people he thought were his parents were actually life decoy models that were a part of the Chameleon's plot, which also shatters him to the core. Also, just the idea of Vulture as a life stealer is pretty dark to me. I kind of wish he had those powers even without the Juvenator. I think it would just make him a cooler villain as well. Number 8. Secrets. This Spider-Man story from the 1980s appeared in the Spider-Man and the Power of Pack comic, and it was both dark and touching all at once. In it, Peter Parker saves a young boy from being physically abused by his sitter, Judy, and reveals that as a young child, Peter Parker himself was also a victim of abuse. His older friend Skip showed him sexy pictures in a magazine and tried to get young Peter to reenact the images with him. Peter told adults that he trusted about the abuse, and only after rescuing young Tony from a similar situation as an adult, realized that he was never to blame for what happened to him years ago. This is an issue with a powerful message, but it's also pretty dark. Number 7. Maximum Clonage. Maximum Clonage was of course a smaller part of a greater story known as the Clone Saga. In this chapter, spread across a few different comics' individual issues, Peter was led to believe that he was actually the clone and Ben Reilly was the original Peter Parker. This drove him somewhat mad and ended up causing him to at one point strike Mary Jane, who was also pregnant at the time. This story also involves the almost death of Kane, who sacrifices himself to protect Peter, and Maximum Clonage pretty much starts off in Spider-Man Maximum Clonage Alpha with a nice recap of just all the terrible things that have happened to Peter previous to this story. Clone Saga was a rough time for Peter actually in general. Number 6. The Other. The Other is one of the most depressing stories in Spider-Man history. Spider-Man finds himself plagued on all sides by enemies while also learning at the same time that he is rapidly dying. Peter is determined to find a cure for his mystery illness and reaches out to his friends and colleagues in the superhero community, known for their brilliant minds. The unfortunate thing is, no one seems to have an answer, and as each day passes, Peter moves closer and closer to death. Doctor Strange, after looking Peter over, even confesses that a magical cure does not exist for what ails him. It seems no matter where Peter turns, no one has an answer, and the villain Morlun lurks in the shadows, taunting Spider-Man, enjoying his suffering. At one point, Morlun also viciously attacks Spider-Man, beating him bloody and even eating one of his eyes. Yikes. Only the police managed to save Spider-Man from being fully devoured by the villain during that fight. Number 5. Back in Black. After Kingpin finds out Spider-Man's secret identity, he targets those that Peter Parker loves the most, and successfully has Aunt May shot. Aunt May clings to life in the ICU, and Peter is so broken up over this, he sets out to find out who is behind the attack. He uncovers Kingpin's involvement. Kingpin, of course, is currently in prison, but still managed to order the hit from the comfort of his cell, still holding great power and influence even while locked up. Spider-Man dons his black costume and pays Kingpin a visit, but when he fights him, he fights as Peter Parker, removing his shirt and his mask. He almost beats Wilson Fisk to death, but he holds back. However, Aunt May's life, Peter tells Fisk, is the only thing that is keeping Peter from killing Kingpin. He tells Fisk that he better pray that Aunt May makes it through, because if she doesn't, Peter will be back to finish the job. Number 4. SpiderGenium. Anytime we have a story that involves the fate of all spider totems, it's usually pretty dark. SpiderGenium was the sequel story to Spider-Verse. In this story, the Inheritors manage to return thanks to superior Spider-Man's cloning tech. Some of the Spider-Man armies show up to put a stop to their return, but too late. Instantly, in issue number 1, we lose Spider-Man Noir and Spider-Man UK, just like that. Even if you aren't a fan of the Inheritors, you can't deny that energy vampires are pretty dark. Fortunately, this story gets a happy ending, and most of the spider totems we lose come back in some capacity, including Ben Reilly, who acknowledges just how many deaths he's had previous to this one, literally as he dies. But still, the amount that is at stake, as well as the fast-paced deaths that launch us into action, makes SpiderGenium a fairly dark one, filled with action and loss. Number 3. Revelations. This story was pretty dark because it was the one where it was revealed that Mary Jane and Peter Parker's baby was kidnapped by none other than Norman Osborn for some insidious plot that, well, it's still never really been revealed, even over 20 years later. We were led to believe the baby was spirited away by a woman working for Osborn, Allison Mongrain, and was perhaps still alive years later. However, Norman would go on to claim that the baby was dead. Allison Mongrain slipped something into Mary Jane's food at a restaurant, causing her to go into early labor, and then disguised as a nurse stole the suspected stillborn infant. Mary Jane was told her child was dead, but it was later implied that the baby survived. This whole story is just all kinds of messed up. Also, poor Mary Jane. She's been through so much stuff. Number 2. Reign. This story involves an old senile Spider-Man who lost Mary Jane to cancer years earlier, which he discovers his own radioactivity caused. He has retired from being Spider-Man and now owns a flower shop, but hallucinations and incessant injustices cause him to attempt to return to a life of heroics once more. However, Spider-Man is now an old, kinda deranged man, and as such this story mostly involves him getting his butt kicked in between hallucinations of Mary Jane's ghost and her rotting corpse. Number 1. Sins Past. One of the darkest Spider-Man stories to date that continues to haunt my nightmares is Sins Past. This story starts in Amazing Spider-Man issue 509. In it we learn that Gwen Stacy had an affair with Norman Osborn, which resulted in a pregnancy. Gwen secretly gave birth to twins, and their existence was forever kept secret from Peter Parker. Osborn raised the two children to hate Spider-Man, making them believe that Spider-Man was their father and had killed their mother, when in reality Osborn was their father. And he also kinda killed their mother. This whole story was an extra level of dark and twisted that makes it both unforgettable and at the time something you kinda wish you could forget. Thank you so much for watching, Nerd Squad. What are some of your favorite Spider-Man stories? Which do you think are the darkest? Who is your favorite Spider-Folk of all time? Let us know in the comments below. And speaking of comments, it's time to turn to some comments from one of our latest videos, Top 10 Dark Alternate Versions of the Suicide Squad. Dice Diablo comments, "Can't wait to see the Arkhamverse in action. Here's hoping for Deathstroke." Oh my goodness, that would be so cool to see Deathstroke in that game and just in general. Also, I want to play as Deathstroke in a video game. Is that possible? Ronald Marcano comments, "Villains are usually fun to watch." This is true, I would agree with this. Sunstar comments, "No matter the rotation, there's no Suicide Squad without our girl Harley Quinn. Original Suicide Squad actually didn't have Harley Quinn, but I can't help but agree with you because I just think everything needs a little bit more Harley Quinn. You can never have too much Harley in my opinion." And that's all the time we have for comments today. Be sure to comment below for a chance to have your thoughts and feels shouted out in a future list. This has been Top 10 Nerd and I'm your host Amanda McKnight, reminding you to stay nerdy, YouTube.